Afternoon. I'm Mark Mather with PRB. I want to thank everyone for joining us for today's webinar on using Excel tools to work with data more effectively. The presenter for today's presentation is Beth Jarras, who will take about 45 minutes to provide a live demonstration of several Excel tools that can help you organize and manipulate your data tables more effectively. Beth is a senior research associate and a colleague of mine here in PRB's U.S. Programs Department. This is the first of several webinars planned for this year by PRB with funding from the Annie E. Casey Foundation. And I just have a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started. First, if you have any questions that you'd like to submit to Beth, please type them into the question box in your webinar control panel. We're going to save the questions until the end. We do have a lot of people on the webinar today, so if we don't get through all of the questions, I'm sure Beth would be happy to answer your questions offline. And then, more importantly, this webinar is being recorded today, so if you get confused or if you fall behind in terms of any of the steps that Beth's going through, I don't want you to panic because you'll be able to go back and view the recording at any time. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Beth.
Thank you, Mark. Mark did a great introduction. So what I'm going to do is jump right into objectives. For this webinar, we will use 3 tools: filters, VLOOKUP, and pivot tables to answer some questions about data that I downloaded from the KidsCount website. And I wanted to let you know in advance, I will demonstrate each tool or technique at least twice, so there's no need to panic if you miss a step. And so we will walk through each step more than once. And as Mark mentioned, the webinar will be recorded so you can go back and watch again. And we will take as many questions as we can during the course of the webinar itself, but if we run out of time, I'm happy to answer questions via email after the webinar ends. One thing that I want to start with is to make sure we're all using the same terminology in the Excel interface. So this part may be review for you, but bear with me. The next few minutes will really help set the foundation for the remainder of the webinar. I should note that the example you're seeing on the screen here may look a little bit different from how Excel looks back at your own desk, whether you're using a different version or because you have your options set differently. What I'm showing is Excel 2013 for Windows. But whatever version you're using or however you have your Windows set up, the fundamentals are very similar across versions. All Excel files are set up with a worksheet or workbooks. I'm sorry, a worksheet or worksheets grouped into a workbook. And tools are grouped in similar ways across all versions of Excel. In 2013, a piece of the interface that I will be referring to fairly often is the ribbon. And by the ribbon, what I'm talking about is this menu bar at the top of the screen here. Excel has a vertical scroll bar along the right-hand side of the interface and a horizontal scroll bar on the bottom right. Below the horizontal scroll bar is what's called a zoom control, so you can make the text bigger or smaller and see more or less of your worksheet at any one time. There's also a status bar, which we tend to overlook and seems kind of boring, but we can use that for some sort of quick on-the-fly calculations, and I will demonstrate how to use that later on. In addition, there are worksheet tabs. Any workbook may have one or more worksheets within it. There's also an active cell, and the active cell basically means the cell that you currently have selected and the one that you're working in. And if your active cell is someplace outside of the section of the worksheet that you're looking at, you can always figure out what cell you have highlighted because it shows up in the name box in the top left corner. It's to the left of the function bar. And there's also a function bar or formula bar where you can type in text, formulas, functions, or numbers. Also, you will hear me use the term range fairly often in this webinar. And by range, I mean a collection of contiguous selected cells. For today's exercise, all of the data for the demos comes directly from the KidsCount website. I downloaded population data by age and by state. And with that data, we will filter the information for a quick summary. We'll add abbreviations and FIPS codes using VLOOKUP. We will group data by age and summarize and tabulate the data. I should note that I downloaded the data directly, and I've made very few formatting changes. If you go to the indicator page on the KidsCount website, just above the title, there is a little section called Raw Data, and if you click on that, it downloads the information for you. And the only changes I made to this data are to widen the columns a little bit, and I locked the top row so that as we scroll through the worksheet, we'll always know what the field headers are. Otherwise, the information that you're seeing for this demo is exactly what you would download if you clicked on that raw data button on the KidsCount website. So let's get to our first example. How can I find out the number of 5-year-olds in Florida from 2000 to 2014? We're going to answer that question using a data filter. Let's jump into Excel and try this out. As you can see, the data that I've downloaded includes every state, ages 0 through 18 with the field for total 18 and below, for all years from 1990 through 2014. And for the question I'm trying to answer here, I'm looking specifically for data for Florida and only for 5-year-olds and in the range from 2000 to 2014. So what I'm going to use here is a tool called a data filter. I'm going to start by selecting the entire table of data. And then once I have that table of data selected, I'm going to go to the Data menu on the ribbon and click the Filter or Funnel icon. Now you'll notice that each one of those columns has a little drop-down arrow at the top of it. And we can use these arrows to help us filter the data. In our example, we want information for Florida. So I'm going to click on the drop-down arrow next to location, and you'll see that we have all of the states that are in the data set and the United States, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico showing up in our list. I don't want all of those. I only want Florida. So I'm going to click on Select All to uncheck that option so no states are selected. And then I'm going to scroll through the list until I get to Florida. I'm going to click on that and say OK. And now I have only Florida records showing. Now we still see all ages in the list, and I only really am interested in 5-year-olds to answer this question. So I'm going to do something very similar for single year of age. I'm going to click on the drop-down arrow next to single year. I'm going to uncheck Select All, click the checkbox next to 5, and say OK. So now I'm seeing all of the 5-year-olds in Florida from 1990 through 2014. But we're only interested in years 2000 to 2014 to answer this question. And so in the time frame column, I'm going to click on that arrow. And instead of unchecking lots of numbers or checking 2000, 2001, 2002, what I'm going to use is number filters. So I'm going to mouse over number filters, and I'm going to say greater than or equal to. Click that. And in the context window that pops up, I'm going to say greater than or equal to 2000 and say click OK. And now the data are filtered out so that years prior to 2000 no longer show in my table. Now, one of the things to note about filters that can either be an advantage or disadvantage depending on how you're working with the data is that all of the information is still there. We've just queried out and sort of hidden all of the data that we don't want. One way to visualize this or to see this is that the row headers on the left-hand side of your worksheet have turned blue, which implies that they're out of sequence numerically. And you see these sort of thicker bars, which implies that there are hidden rows here. And so all of the data still exists in the worksheet. Those rows are just collapsed and hidden so we don't see them. If you want only this information and you want to work with it for another reason, you want to take this and turn it into a chart, a really useful technique here is to select these filtered results, go back to the home menu and copy them, open a new workbook, and then in the paste menu, you can either paste as values here or click on Paste Special, paste as values, and click OK. And so now you only have the results that you filtered out. If we go back to the original example, you'll see in a minute that all of those results, or all of the original data, are still there. So once I've filtered out the information I want, I've extracted it and pasted it into a new worksheet, I may want all of that original raw data back. And we can do that in one of two ways. Under the Data menu again, I can, if you look next to the filter funnel icon, there's a smaller icon with a little red X that says clear. We could click on this one. We could go down to these context arrows in the filtered data itself, and you'll notice that when there's a filter on a field, it goes from an arrow to a funnel. I could find that same filter icon here on each one of the fields, and I could go through and uncheck each one. If I click up here, it undoes all of the filters. And if I want to get rid of these drop-down arrows completely, turn the filtering tool off, I click on this filter icon again, and it removes the filtering from my table completely. So, I mentioned we're going to do everything twice, so let's do another example. How can I find out which states had more than 5 million children aged 0 to 18 in the year 2014? Again, we'll be using data filters to answer that question. I'm going to go back to my raw data. I could start by selecting the entire table again, but one other sort of neat feature to note is that Excel has gotten smarter and smarter over the years, and oftentimes if you just have one cell highlighted within your data table and you click on the filter icon, it will figure out the range of data available to be filtered. So you'll see that just by having one cell selected and clicking on the filter icon, again, it has added those drop-down arrows to the top of each column. So let's start to answer our question. We're looking for states that have 5 million or more children or youth aged 0 to 18 in 2014. So let's look for, we want to filter out just this total 18 and below. I'm going to click on the arrow next to single year of age, uncheck select all, scroll down through the list, and pick total 18 and below. So I'm only looking at that variable. We want information only for 2014, so under time frame, I'm going to go over here, and in the text box, I'm going to type in 2014 instead of clicking on or off any of those checkbox options. And you'll see that I get 2014. That text box feature can be really useful. You can look for entire names, or you can look for parts of names. For example, I could look for locations that have the letters S and O next to each other in the location names. So under location, if I click on that drop-down arrow and type SO in the search box and say OK, I'll get South Dakota and South Carolina, which I would expect, and also Missouri because there's an SO, and Minnesota because there's an SO. So that text search is also particularly useful. Not relevant to this particular example, so I'm going to clear that filter from location. And I'm going to use one more filtering tool to find that 5 million and over. In this data set, data is the population field, so I'm going to click on the arrow next to data. And then in number filters, I'm going to do greater than or equal to, and type 5 million, and OK. And now I see that Texas and California both have more than 5 million children and youth aged 18 and younger. You'll also notice, though, that the United States shows up in this list, which you may or may not want. In this case, I only want information about states with population aged 18 and younger. So I want to turn off this row for the United States. So I'm going to click on the location button. And you'll notice when we first started this filtering exercise, all of the states, all 50 states, the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico and the United States were in our list. But now we only see 3. These drop-down content menus are context sensitive, so that once we apply a filter to one field, it limits the results that we see as options in the remaining fields. And so in this case, we see only the 3 locations and not all 53. So here I'm going to uncheck the United States and click OK. And now I have my 2 states that have population of more than 5 million children and youth 18 and younger. Again, to clear the filters, I could go back to each one of these drop-downs and click Clear Filter, or I can come up to the Data menu and click Clear, which removes the filters from the entire table. And to turn the filter tool off completely, I can click the filter icon again. So we've answered a couple of questions using filtering. But oftentimes the information you need to work with is in more than one table, and you need to join that data in some way. So the question we're going to try to answer next is, how can I link this data table that I've downloaded from the KidsCount website with information from another table? For example, maybe I want to add state abbreviations, the postal codes, or the FIPS code to the data, and we will do each of those. And we're going to do that using a tool or a function called VLOOKUP. Now, VLOOKUP can be a little bit complicated, so I'm going to go through the concepts behind VLOOKUP first before we jump into an example. VLOOKUP searches through a table of data and returns the value it finds in the first matching row from that table. VLOOKUP is an easy way to search for data, and it's searching for your search term in a table and giving you information from any other row to the, or anywhere else in that same row to the right of that search term. So in the example you see on the screen here, is Excel is searching for the contents of cell G9, which in this case is the text California, in the leftmost column of the table that's highlighted in red here. So it's going to look down this column and look for the word California. Once it finds that, it's going to return what it finds in the second column next to California, in this case the word West. And we'll break this down in a little bit more detail. All functions in Excel begin with an equal sign, then a function name, and then parentheses. And within those parentheses, there can be any one from 0 to many arguments. And VLOOKUP takes 4 arguments. The first one is the lookup value. That's telling Excel what thing it is you're trying to match. In this case, it could be text set off in quotation marks. It could be a number, or it could be a cell reference. And that tells Excel what it is that you're looking to match. And then you need to tell Excel where to look, which Excel refers to as the table array. In this case, the table array is columns A through E. And again, Excel is going to look in the leftmost column of that table array. So it's going to look in column A to match that lookup value. That lookup value, the word California, could be anywhere else in this table, and it's not going to matter because Excel is only going to look at the column. The column reference is probably the most confusing part of the structure of VLOOKUP. Everywhere else in Excel, we think about columns as letters, column A, column D, column G. But in VLOOKUP, column reference is really the number. It's the first column, second column, third column of this table array. So in this case, the column reference is referring to the third column in this range from A to E. So this is the first, second, third. It will return the values it finds in this column right here. And then the last piece is you always want to end a lookup statement with false. This conditional term tells Excel not to return fuzzy matches. If we didn't put false here, Excel would return the value it finds that's closest to the search term, either in alphabetical or numerical order. In other words, if Excel can't find the word Alabama, it might return the value for Alaska. So let's go and jump into our example. Before we get going on adding the postal code, I want to let you know that I've already created a lookup table that has each of the state names, the region, the census abbreviation, or the postal abbreviation that I want to add, and also FIPS code in it. So this is another table that I've added to the workbook in addition to the raw data that I downloaded. What I want to do in this particular example is add state abbreviation. And so I'm going to type an equal sign, VLOOKUP, open my parentheses. I want to match what I'm finding in this column here, so the location name in cell A2. I could either type A2 or click on cell A2, comma. I'm going to go over to that state IDs table that I mentioned at the beginning and highlight from B to D. So my leftmost column has that location name I'm trying to match. Column D has the postal abbreviation I want to be the result. And what I want to return is from the third column of that range, so 1, 2, 3. So I'm going to type comma 3, and then end it with comma false, close my parentheses, and click enter. And we'll see that for the United States, the state abbreviation is US. Makes sense. And let's fill this down and see if it's working for other states. So for Alaska, I get the abbreviation AK. For Arkansas, I get the abbreviation AR, California CA, so on and so forth. That looks pretty good, except Alabama. I have something interesting going on here. For Alabama, I'm getting 0, which is clearly not the correct state abbreviation. So what's going wrong? Let's look at our state IDs lookup table and see what might be happening. Well, in the case of Alabama, the state abbreviation field is blank. And Excel, when it's using VLOOKUP, thinks of any blank as a 0. And so a 0 doesn't necessarily mean that the value is 0. It may also mean that the value it's finding in that matched row is blank. In this case, there's a simple fix. We just type in the letters AL. We go back to our worksheet, and we have fixed the problem. Alabama now has the AL abbreviation. The next thing I want to do is add age group. We have single year of age data, but later on I want to group into a custom set of age ranges. I want to group this data for ages 0 to 5 and 6 to 18. And I've, again, already created a lookup table. So for each year, I've told Excel which category I want that to be in. So for age 0, 0 to 5, for age 4, that's in the 0 to 5 category. For age 13, that's in the 6 to 18 category, so on and so forth. So I'm going to label my column, and I'm going to start my VLOOKUP, saying equals VLOOKUP. I want to look for this single year of age, comma. I'm going to come over to my lookup, age group lookup table and highlight the range from A to B, type a comma. And the data that I'm matching against is in the leftmost. The data that I want to return is in column 2. And again, comma false. Close my parentheses and enter. And I'm going to fill this down before I explain that NA. And we'll notice that for age 1, Excel correctly identifies that as the 0 to 5-year-old age group. For age 2, 0 to 5. Mostly it looks like it's working, except right here. What's going on? This #NA is telling me that Excel can't find this string with the less than 1 symbol in the lookup table. And if we go over to the age group lookup, you'll notice that indeed it's not there. We have 0, we have 1, but there isn't something here that's less than 1. In this case, we can fix that problem by adding that record to our list. So I'll say less than 1 and 0 to 5. Added to my lookup table. I'll come back to my worksheet, and now I can see that that is indeed the correct age group assigned to that row. I have the same problem here with the total 18 and below, that this value or this string of text isn't showing up in the lookup table. So I'm going to copy this string, go back over to my lookup table, add it, and say that that's going to be total population age 18 and younger is going to be the label that I want the lookup to return. And then last but certainly not least, something that we probably do on a regular basis is trying to find the FIPS code for a given state or county or city. And what I'm going to do now is, using that same state IDs lookup that I started with earlier, type VLOOKUP, open my parentheses. I'm going to look for this location, comma. I'm going to come over to my state IDs table, and I have a problem here. In the other examples I mentioned, the VLOOKUP wants the thing that you're looking for to be in the leftmost column of your lookup range. But FIPS is to the left of the location name. So for this lookup to work, I need to move this FIPS code over to the right somehow. I'm going to cancel out of that VLOOKUP, come back to my state IDs table. I'm going to cut this FIPS code. I'm going to insert it to the right of the location name. And now I can go ahead and build that lookup. So VLOOKUP, open parentheses, I want to look for this value in my state IDs. Grab the range from A to B, comma, 2 because the thing that I want to return is in the second column, comma false, and I'm going to fill that down, and Alabama gets FIPS code 1, California gets FIPS code 6. You'll notice that I'm looking through examples. It's always good practice to do a little bit of spot checking when you're using formulas like VLOOKUP or filtering. But it seems like this VLOOKUP is working, except what's going on with the FIPS code. We know that the FIPS code for the United States is not 999. One other important thing to keep in mind about VLOOKUP is that it returns the first match it finds in your data, not necessarily the match that you were hoping for. So in this case, you'll see that there are 2 records for United States. One has FIPS code 999, one has FIPS code 0. In order to get this to work correctly, we could do one of 2 things. We could delete this row, or we could take this information with the 999 and move it down below the one with FIPS code 0. Go back to our lookup, and you'll see that now, because the record with FIPS code 0 is showing up before the record with FIPS code 999, we're returning the 0 instead. Talked about what to do if we're missing records or if they're out of order. And the sort of piece de resistance in this webinar, I think, is pivot tables. What I want to do now is take this long form, really long string of data that we've downloaded and turn it into a much more tabular format. And I want to use a pivot table to help me summarize the population for age 0 to 5 for all states over time. So just like we did with the Excel interface, I want to spend a couple of minutes walking through the pivot table interface, which is a little bit different than anything else in Excel. And I'll warn you, the pivot table interface looks intimidating, but with drag and drop options, pivot tables might just become your Excel best friend. Pivot tables can be used to summarize, cross-tabulate, aggregate, and or filter your data. They allow us to take that long format data and turn it into a table. Within that table, we can aggregate data across categories, filter and select records, and summarize results. So there's a lot of power in this tool. And a little bit of pivot table terminology. The crosstab itself is what we refer to as the pivot table. On the right-hand side of this screen, you'll see that there's a pivot table control panel or pivot table builder. At the top of that list are pivot table fields. And this is automatically populated by Excel with the column header for whatever data that you've selected. And we can drag and drop those fields in the pivot table fields list down to this builder area below that allows us to filter, to group, or to cross-tabulate the data. In this area below, there's a columns list, and any variable you drag from the fields area down to columns is going to become the header, the column header, or the labels across the top of your pivot table. Any variable you drag down to the row list is going to populate those row labels on the left-hand side of your pivot table. The value field is going to populate the middle, so that's basically what you think of as the cross-tabulation. That's the data you're cross-tabbing. And then we can also filter the data, and the filter shows up as a little section above your cross-tab. So let's go ahead and jump into an example. To start, you want to select the entire range of data that you want to work with in your pivot table. So in this case, I'm going to grab everything from columns A through column H. And I do want to repeat the fact that for pivot tables to work, you really do need to have a column header at the top of every one of these columns. So if I had left age group blank here, the pivot table would potentially give me an error message. So make sure you have column headers before you get started. Now in the ribbon, I'm going to click on the Insert menu. And the very first option on the left-hand side is Pivot Table. The first question that you get asked is, have you selected the correct range? In this case, from sheet 1, we want columns A through H, and that's perfect. Down here, it also asks, do you want the pivot table to be placed in a new worksheet or somewhere within your existing worksheet? I almost always put the data into a new worksheet. And the reason why is that when you refresh a pivot table, it has the power to overwrite other things in your worksheet, which never seems like a good idea. So best practice is click on New Worksheet and click OK. And now you'll see sort of the outline of what we were working with. Before I start dragging and dropping, I want to refresh everyone. We saw it in the PowerPoint, but I want to do a little explanation of what we're going to be looking for. What I want to do is look for the population age 0 to 5 by year, by state. And I'm showing an example on the screen. A really good practice, especially if you're new to pivot tables, is to actually diagram what you want the pivot table to look like out on paper or on your whiteboard before you get started dragging and dropping. But let's go ahead and drag and drop. So we want years across the top. So I'm going to grab time frame and drag that down to the columns field. I want the state names or location names across the left. So I'm going to grab location from the pivot table fields area and drag that down to rows and drop it there. And you'll remember that data is the field header for that population variable. So I'm going to grab data and drop it into the values area. And we see lots of 20s. What's going on here? You'll notice that in values, right here it says count of data. If you're doing data quality control or validation, this actually can be a really useful tool that when you build your pivot table, you have the ability to count how many times Wyoming shows up in 1993 or how many times Arizona shows up with records for 1990. And you can make sure that you have the correct number of rows and columns in your data set. In this case, that's really not helping us answer the question. What we really want is the sum of population for each of these times in each of these states. So to do that, I'm going to click here on Count of Data, the little drop-down arrow next to Count of Data. And the context menu has an option that says Value Field Settings. If you click on that, in the box that pops up, there's an option for Sum. So we're going to click on Sum instead of Count. Say OK. And now these are starting to look a lot more like population totals. But this is probably more population than there are age 0 to 5 in Alabama in 1990. So we still need to filter out just that 0 to 5-year-old age group. To do that, I'm going to click on age group in the fields list and drag that down to the filters area. And you'll notice it's added a little drop-down box at the top of the pivot table here. If we click on that arrow next to all in that drop-down box, we get 0 to 5, 6 to 18, and the total 18 and younger, the 3 age group labels we added earlier. I'm going to click on 0 to 5 and say OK. And now we have a cross-tab of, for every state, for every year, the population age 0 to 5. Again, it's always a good idea to validate the work that you're doing. Just do a quick spot check and make sure you're getting the results you think you should be getting. So for Alabama in 1990, we have 343,093 children aged 0 to 5. We go back to our raw data, and we look for Alabama 1990, the population age 5 and younger, and I select those cells. You'll see down here in the status bar, it gives us some really quick information about that. The average is 557,000. I've got 6 cells selected, and the sum of those is 343,098. So this, what I expected to get for population age 0 to 5 for Alabama in 1990 is indeed what the pivot table is giving me. So it's sort of a nice double check. One of the other things you may notice about the pivot table, the way it's set up automatically, is that all of the states show up in alphabetical order, even though in our raw data the United States is at the top of the list. It shows up near the bottom in the alphabetical sorting. That may not be how we want the data to be displayed. We may want the United States record to be at the top no matter what. So we scroll through the list. We find the record we want to move, in this case the United States, select that label, and if you right-click and mouse up to move, we can move the United States all the way to the beginning of the list, all the way to the end, up one or down one. So let's move the United States all the way to the beginning. And now, no matter what we do with our raw data, how we sort our raw data, the United States will always show up at the top of this pivot table crosstab. Now, one of the other things you may have noticed in the crosstab is that as I was scrolling down to look for the United States, you may have noticed that the Puerto Rico data were all showing up as zeros. Does that really mean that in 1990 there were 0 children aged 0 to 5 in Puerto Rico? Probably not. Let's go back to our raw data and find out what's going on. If I scroll down through my raw data, I can see that there are a bunch of NAs. So sort of like when we're doing a VLOOKUP, if Excel finds a blank, it returns the value 0. Pivot tables in this crosstab area only can return numeric values. And so if Excel finds a blank, an empty cell, or if it finds text, it's going to interpret that as 0 numbers. In the event that we had data for Puerto Rico, we could add that to our file. I'm going to do that right now very quickly. We go back to our raw data and we add the information for Puerto Rico for 1990. Go back to our pivot table. Well, it still looks like there's a 0 there. What we need to do is right-click on any cell in the pivot table and mouse up to refresh and click refresh. And you'll see that any values we add, rows we delete, rows we add to the pivot table, the raw data behind the pivot table, will appear when we right-click and choose refresh. So we've seen how we can create a table that shows population for age 0 to 5 for all states over time. There's another example that I wanted to walk through, summarizing population by age group over time in a particular area. So I want to look at southern New England and look at summing across a couple of different states. So let's take a look at what the result of that table is going to be. What I want to see is data for Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island for each of the age groups for 1990 through 2014. To do that, I'm going to go back to my original raw data. Again, I'm going to select the range that I want to work with, so select from columns A through H. Go to Insert on the menu bar, click on Pivot Table. I'm going to put it into a new worksheet and say OK. In this case, the data are structured a little bit differently. I want age across the top and time frame across the left, so I'm going to click on single age in the fields area and drag that to columns. I'm sorry, not single age, age group. Age group and drag that to columns. I'm going to grab time frame from the fields list and drag that down to rows. And again, data into the values area. And again, we have the problem where we have count of values instead of the sum. So I'm going to click on the little arrow next to count of data, click on value field settings, and choose sum and say OK. And I only want to see the information for 3 states combined. So southern New England combined of Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. So I'm going to grab a location and drag that down to filters. And in the drop-down list in that filter that I've just added, I don't want all states, and I do want to select multiple items. And so I'm going to check this little box here that says Select Multiple Items. I'm going to uncheck all, and I'm going to turn Connecticut, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island back on and say OK. So now I have the population age 0 to 5, 6 to 18, and total 18 and younger for southern New England from 1990 to 2014. But you may also notice that there are grand totals at the bottom of the worksheet and to the right of the worksheet. And in this case, if we mouse over this 0 to 5, 6 to 18, 18 and over, we can see that that's really just double counting the population on the right. And really, does the sum of 0 to 5-year-olds from 1990 to 2014 mean anything? Well, maybe not so much. And so we can turn those options off. In order to turn those off, we're going to go into pivot table options. So select any cell within your pivot table and right-click to open up the context menu. And mouse over pivot table options, click there. And on the totals and filters tab, I'm going to turn off the grand totals for columns and click OK. So now we'll notice that those bizarre sum of 1990 through 2014 totals at the bottom are gone, so the data look a little cleaner. And in the case of the grand total here on the right, there are a couple of things I could do. I could, again, right-click, choose Pivot Table Options, and in the menu, Totals and Filters tab, and I could turn off the grand totals for rows and click OK. And then I would just have my 2 age groups and the summary level variable that I have already. Or, I'm going to undo that, I could turn this age group off. I could turn off this field that is causing the double counting, and then my grand total becomes the sum of 0 to 5 plus 6 to 18. So let's try that option. Here under column labels, you'll notice there's a little drop down. If I click on that, you'll see sort of similar context menu to what we saw when we were doing filtering, and I can turn on or off any of these age groups. So let's turn off the total population aged 18 and younger, and click OK. And now we have 0 to 5, 6 to 18, and the grand total is the sum of these two, the 2478255, 2478255. So the grand total is the population age 0 to 18. So sometimes you may want the grand total, sometimes you may not. It's something to keep in mind as you're building your pivot table. And now I think we have time for one last little trick. One of the things I really like to do, and sort of a neat, really quick, really powerful tool in Excel, is to use conditional formatting to help highlight or identify trends. It's really useful for data checking, for illustrating trends over time, and really easy to use. So I have already done a crosstab and looking at the data, the population age 0 to 5 and 6 to 18 for the state of Utah. And I want to color code these cells in this table so that lower values show up in red and higher values show up in green. And this you can use this conditional formatting tool on any data. It doesn't have to be within a pivot table. So I'm going to select all of the data, so from 1990 through 2014 for both age groups. And then here on the home ribbon, there's a menu called conditional formatting. If you click on that, you'll see that there are lots and lots and lots of options here. There are color bars, there are color scales, you can highlight cells that are greater than or less than something, but let's do a quick color scale where the lower values are red, the higher values are green, and click OK. And you'll see that the population age 0 to 5 is darker red in 1990, lighter red in 2014, implying that it's growing. 6 to 18 is those numbers are larger, so they're showing up in green, and they get darker green as time goes on. And so that's sort of a neat little quick tool to visualize the data. And last but not least, a couple of parting thoughts. Perhaps the best advice I have for any work within Excel is, the slide says experiment, but really play. The things that I know how to do in Excel, I learned through trial and error and just trying things out. If you are afraid of breaking your data or deleting something accidentally, just save a copy of your work and try out the technique on a copy before you sort of put it into full production. So have fun. And with that, we'll open it up for questions.
Great. Thanks so much, Beth. This is actually the third time I've seen this presentation. I still seem to learn something new every time I see it. So a lot of good information. I think people are still digesting this. We don't have any questions that have come in yet, but if anybody has questions, please go ahead and type them into the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. I had a quick question, Beth, regarding the VLOOKUP. Because I know there's also an H lookup, and I wondered if that's essentially the same thing and it's just a matter of not being used as much because of the way our data are typically set up.
Yeah, H lookup functions pretty similarly, but it's doing the same thing across columns instead of down rows. And yes, VLOOKUP is much more often used because we tend to structure our data so that each row is a record as opposed to each column is a record.
Okay. We do have a question that just came in. How do you get an original data set to be formatted so that the years, with the years in the same column vertically instead of in multiple columns? The years in the same column vertically instead of putting the years in multiple columns. So I guess it's sort of the way that we often format the data for the Kids Count project. Or
oh, so it's the question. If the person can type back and answer, it's the opposite of this. It's the taking 1990, adding a label that says 1990, taking 1991, adding a label that says 1991, and sort of reverse uncross tabbing. Is that?
I think that's right. So we're talking about taking away all of these columns and stacking everything.
Yes. Not so much using the tools we've looked at here. There are a variety of tricks using lookup and nested if statements that I use to do that technique. So this may be a question that's better if the person emails me and sends an example. I can show how I restructure the data.
Okay.
And that is something I was actually just doing that this morning for vaccine preventable diseases.
Yeah. Another question, is it possible to rename the grand total label in a pivot table? So let's say in your example, renaming the grand total to total population under 18.
Yes, there is an option under, I think it's pivot table options, under, no, this one may be one, or maybe value field settings. There is a way to relabel, but of course it's an on-the-fly question. I'm not, I'm not necessarily going to remember it. I may send out an email after the fact with an answer to this one.
Okay. Any other questions? I know it was a lot of information presented, and some of it did go quickly. So if questions do come up after you go back and review some of these things, feel free to email me or Beth, and we can get back to you.
Yep, my contact information is on the bottom left of the screen there. You're welcome to send me. I love answering Excel questions, so you're welcome to send them to me at any time.
Okay. A couple that just came in. Can you create a chart using a pivot table, using the data that you put into a pivot table?
There is an option to do pivot charts. I find the formatting really horribly clunky. That it adds a lot of labeling and things on the charts that you don't necessarily want. But you can do the same thing that we did earlier. You can also copy the results of the pivot table, paste them into a new worksheet, and use that to do the charts. That tends to be my preferred technique just because I don't like the automatic formatting that comes with pivot charts.
Right. And someone just wanted to confirm that this is recorded. It is being recorded, so we'll send out a link to this recording within, if not today, we'll send it out tomorrow, so everyone will have that. And can you make the default value for the pivot table so that it returns sum instead of count, so you don't have to change it every time?
I have not seen that option, and I wish it existed. Yeah. It may. I've looked, but I haven't found it.
Okay. And here's an answer to one of our previous questions. It says you can rename a column in the pivot table by highlighting the text you want to change and type the new title in the function cell. So I guess right up there, yeah.
I'm not sure. Does it work when you refresh? Oh, it does stay when you refresh. You can't do that. Oh, this may be a newer feature. If you try to type, interesting. If you try to type over a value within the pivot table, you get this error, cannot change this part of a pivot table report. But even I learned something in today's webinar. Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? That may be all of our questions.
Well, thank you, everyone.
Well, I want to thank everyone for participating today, and I especially want to thank Beth for taking the time to do this. It's always a little bit dicey to do a live demonstration of any software, so but I think that you've done a great job of summarizing some useful tools. I want to let people know also that we're planning at least 3 more webinars during this calendar year on other either software or data issues that people might be able to use in their work. So with that, I think that concludes today's webinar. I hope to see many of you at the upcoming KidsCount Data Workshop. Thanks again, Beth.
Thank you.